Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Newcastle. Welcome to the Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and to this roundtable style event which brings together an interdisciplinary mix of participants. Between us, we bring diverse scholarly experience and expertise to our central topic of critical language research, from sociolinguistics, social and linguistic anthropology, and related areas of the humanities and social sciences. This event benefits from funding support from a number of sponsors. Firstly, the Open World Research Initiative, housed at London University's Institute of Modern Languages Research, Newcastle's Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the School of Modern Languages here at Newcastle, and Newcastle's Institute of Social Science. I also extend thanks to your institutions, where they have helped to defray costs, and to those of you who are here in a self-funding capacity. And I also thank Carolyn Taylor, the School of Modern Languages Research Support Officer, for her invaluable assistance. As we have kept this event to limited numbers, we're filming the proceedings in order to make it available online for those who are unable to attend in person. Well, I'm just going to give a wee bit of an introductory preamble to what we're going to be doing today. So, while many of us experience researching in Latin America, others of us focus on other parts of the world. So I hope that the debate we're going to have today will cross over divides of geography and discipline to deepen our understandings of the regional particularities with which we're most familiar. In addition to our keynote speakers and panellists, who will be speaking more formally, we also welcome our other registered participants who represent a mix of relevant expertise. And so we hope that when it comes to the debate, everybody in the room will feel free to contribute. All of us are concerned with language, I think we agree, as an integral and constitutive dimension of cultural, social and political life. In my call for papers, I identified a couple of paradoxes as a core concern for critical language research and suggested that there are surely others. The first of the paradoxes goes something as follows. In critical sociolinguistic theory, rooted in empirical research, the received wisdom about the bounded nature of language has been challenged and greatly overcome. The work on translanguaging, which Angela and Adrian will talk about today, is a key example of this. And yet, in the sphere of language policy and planning for speakers of indigenous languages in post-colonial and multilingual settings, such as we find in Latin America, there is some way to go to acknowledge and apply these advances in policy-making spheres. Language mixture, while it is demonstrably part of the social-linguistic reality of indigenous children's lives, is not taken into account in the design and implementation of the intercultural bilingual education programs of which the same children are the target. On the contrary, an ideology of purism tends to prevail in language planning circles. In developing written teaching materials in the indigenous languages, such purism may present an obstacle to cognition and be one reason among many for why parents and teachers may resist the use of the teaching of the indigenous languages in the primary school system and beyond. Second paradox. Linguistic anthropologists have shown, based on ethnographic evidence from around the world, that there is much diversity in language's role. For example, in child socialization, the ways in which it constructs social relationships in differentiated ways across the life cycle, the ontological status of interlocutors in linguistic exchanges, human, non-human, and others, and the ways in which language may work together with other media of communication, for example, in Latin American indigenous rituals, the use of tobacco and coca leaves, and how language constructs the human relationship with the natural world. And moreover, as Jan and Guillerme's paper will show, language's nature may go beyond what we habitually take language to be and what we take it to do. Yet this diversity in the nature of language is rarely, I suggest, recognised and taken advantage of in the design of language policy in the multilingual settings of Latin America with which I'm familiar. So could we use today, could we use our discussion today to confirm, challenge and theoretically examine these paradoxes, even begin to shape an agenda for addressing them in practical ways with policy in mind? So that's a big question for all of us to be thinking about. In doing so, I'd just like to add that we also need to bear in mind the broader social and political context in which indigenous and minority, if we're thinking about other parts of the world, education policy and language rights legislation are formulated. To a large extent, the reasons for the apparently perennial gap between legislation that looks good on paper and its implementation on the ground can be sought here. Although each context has its particularities, in Latin America, the UK and other parts of the world, they are surely always related to power and to the economic priorities of the state, respectively in control. In the case of the Andean countries, where I've worked particularly, this issue is one of a deep incompatibility between the demands, value systems and aspirations of the indigenous peoples and the fact that their lands, key to their existence, occupy terrain rich in natural resources, minerals, oil, natural gas, which the state seeks to exploit by granting concessions to national and transnational companies for the purpose. So this leads to clearly divergent agendas between, for example, in the case of Peru, the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry for Mines and Energy. So, just going back to the call for papers to remind us of some of the topics I suggested, and we're going to be hearing about some of those and others today, just as a sort of aide-memoire. I suggested ethnography of speaking among indigenous or minority language communities, anthropological understandings of the nature of language in indigenous or minority language communities, cultural understandings and uses of language mixture in indigenous or minority language communities, the notion of language and well-being from different disciplinary points of view, critical approaches to language policy design in culturally diverse contexts, experience of the interface between indigenous or minority understandings of the nature of language and language policy design, and lastly, linguistic, anthropological and social linguistic research as a tool for decolonisation. And cutting across all these themes, just to round things off, in the case of Latin America, are deeply embedded issues of race and racism which intersect with the uses of language in a myriad of ways. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on to our first keynote talk today with the title Translanguaging in the City. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Professor Angela Crease and Professor Adrian Blackledge from Stirling University. Adrian and Angela have many publications on social linguistic issues, particularly looking at issues of multilingualism, not just in the UK but also in other parts of the world. So I do invite you to look at their web pages, and you'll find links to some very interesting resources. Angela and Adrian have recently transferred from Birmingham University to Stirling, and they've had a very important project known as TLANG, which is about translanguaging or multilingualism in urban contexts in the UK, and then they've transferred that across to looking at how multilingualism works in South Africa and the usefulness of the translanguaging concept. So very happy to welcome you this morning.
Well, good morning everyone. It's really nice to be here, and thanks Rosalind very much for the invitation. So looking very much to the conversation that we're going to have. So we're going to be talking today about ethnography and how to represent the voices of those that we research with, participate with in doing our research, and the struggles as linguistic ethnographers to bring in the voices of those sites, those people that we work with, and the kind of contradictions that we face in those representations. And as you see, we're going to be focusing on polyphony in particular. urge, this need to bring and represent the voices of our participants is a very familiar one, and I'm sure cuts across sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology, and it's been there for a while. And James Clifford, in 1986, raises this point about how to do the kind of writing that we want to do in our ethnographies. And the reason we're sharing that with you today is that we have been trying to take new avenues, new ways of writing for us, and we want to kind of talk through that with you. So Clifford says ethnographies are complex discursive spaces where many voices clamour for expression. Once dialogism and polyphony are recognised as modes of textual production, the authority of the single voice of the ethnographer is questioned as it is claimed to represent cultures. So what we want to use from this quote is how to, in a sense, background the author, background the academic, and hear other voices in the way we represent the stories that we tell.
So Clifford's notions of dialogism and polyphony, of course, take us straight back to Bakhtin, and his work on, particularly on Dostoevsky's novels, which he regarded as polyphonic and characterized by a plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousnesses, what he called a genuine polyphony of fully valid voices. And this very much resonates with ethnographic research and the representation of ethnographic voice. So we're thinking about polyphony as what Lindlar calls an epistemology which avoids the representation of finalized dialogue and narration as a way to emphasize performativity, thus coming as close as possible to life itself. This is not life as it is represented according to a coherent narrative, but life in its mere existence. It is continuous, ongoing life, which from the perspective of the subject is never finalized, but always in the process of becoming. And perhaps in almost any extended piece of writing, we have a temptation to round things off, to tell a story which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Lindlar is very much talking about resisting this urge to narration and finalizability, if that's a word. And so in exploring ways of reimagining ethnographic writing, we're thinking about metaphors which come from different avenues, different genre, including photography, the novel, particularly the documentary novel, dramaturgy, and poetry.
So we're going to just talk a little about some of those recent influences on our work, and start with the photographer Dorothea Lange, an American photographer who was taking photographs of internal migration during the Great Depression in the 1930s, in which she says what is needed is a new repository of cultural history which focuses on the development of cities. It should be based on personal, direct exposure to what is really there, focusing not on the bizarre or the spectacular, but producing photographs about nothing very much, which describe human life. And this appeals to us on a number of levels. First of all, we'll tell you a little bit more about the T-Lang project in a while, which is very much city-focused, and on the mundane, on the everyday, not on the spectacular. And she goes on to say, in terms of kind of making decisions about what gets taken forward in the stories that we tell and the arguments that we make, she asks a series of questions which we too find useful to us. How do you tell others about what you think is worth telling? That you have either discovered or uncovered or learned or been endowed with in one way or another. What you think is meaningful, not moral, but meaningful. If you have been fortunate enough to have an instrument that's flexible for their purposes, you try, you find your way, and no one can assure you when you've been successful and when you haven't. You never really know. That's what the job is. And this kind of process of curation of what we decide to tell and which bits we extract and the voices that we hear, we find useful.
when documentary novelist Svetlana Alexievich was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2015, the Nobel Committee citation applauded her polyphonic writings, which they said are a monument to suffering and courage in our time. And in her acceptance speech, Alexievich said, "When I walk down the street and catch words, phrases and exclamations, it fascinates me and has made me its captive. I love how humans talk, I love the human voice. It is my greatest love and passion. I collect the everyday life of feelings, thoughts and words. I collect the life of my time." And she says, "There are no borders between fact and fabrication. One flows into the other. Witnesses are not impartial. In telling a story, humans create. They wrestle time like a sculptor does marble. They are actors and creators." And once again, this seems to us to resonate with some of the decisions we take when we are representing the ethnographic voice.
But as Bertolt Brecht tells us, it's not all about empathy. Of course, theatre is very much about empathy, but we need a kind of critical edge to it as well. And that's where the idea of dramaturgy in our work is relevant. So, as Brecht said, as Aristotle states in the Poetics, the theatrical experience comes through an act of empathy. So defined, the adoption of a critical position cannot be among the elements which constitute empathy, and the greater the empathy, the less room for criticism there must be. So as academics, we also have a responsibility to bring in that criticality. In this way, the dramaturg, as Luckhurst said, is part of an interpretational team that includes a director, designer and actors, and is a bridging mechanism to the audience. And increasingly, many of us are working in large interdisciplinary research teams, and that kind of bringing together of academics, non-academics, people in all kinds of ways making the arguments that we make in our research.
In our empirical work, we've been very much struck by in listening to hundreds, possibly thousands of hours of audio recorded social interaction. We've been struck by the rhythm of social life, the rhythm of language in social life. And this takes us to poetry, and particularly Don Patterson, who argues that language is hopelessly rhythmic because we are ourselves hopelessly rhythmic. We start with the rhythm of the self, the heart and respiration, and attend to the rhythm of the other. Everywhere there is interaction between a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy, there is rhythm. So we found ourselves taking rhythm as something we're very much alert to in the ethnographic voice that we're representing.
That brings us to the T-Lang project, which has a much longer title, and once you read through that, you'll see why we call it T-Lang. It was a 4-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities, and they called it a large project. It was very generously funded over those 4 years. It ended last year. Many universities involved, listed at the top, and along the bottom we worked with many other institutions to help us set our research questions and to collaborate with us actually also on our analysis of data. Some were much more involved than others, but that was the design of the project. And in that project, we really worked with this notion of translanguaging. Now, this is one of those slides where I could get kind of stuck on it for about 30 minutes, but I'm not going to. I'm not actually going to go into too much depth about translanguaging as a kind of theoretical idea here. It came from our work in education context, so we were looking at schools which are called complementary schools, supplementary schools, schools outside the mainstream system, run by community groups for the teaching of Gujarati, Punjabi, Mandarin, Cantonese, etc. And in which we became very interested in languaging and some of the problems around languages in the teaching of languages. And we have been, really following this work around the kind of tension in our field between languages as structures and languaging processes in the teaching and learning of these community languages. Of course, many others are doing this work, particularly in educational settings, Ophelia Garcia and Li Wei are two names most associated with work in education. And they define translanguaging here, or talk about translanguaging here. They want to make the argument that language practices of bilinguals are not viewed as two autonomous language systems, but as one linguistic repertoire, with features that have been societally constructed as belonging to two languages. And it is this notion of repertoire that we have been really working with in our work, that we took from educational settings to an understanding in very different social contexts, in which we looked at languaging in markets, libraries, community halls, sporting venues, and languaging we understand as being much more about more than linguistic resources. It's multimodality, it's gesture, sense, the body. And we have written extensively about this. And here we're really trying to think about translanguaging, heteroglossia, and polyphony. Translanguaging in the field of education is very contested at the moment. I mean, it still kind of means lots of things to different people. We have really come to it through a Bakhtinian conceptualization of both centripetal and centrifugal kind of forces of fluidity and standardization and structuring. But as I say, it really is one of those slides that we could talk about at length. And I'm going to leave it there to just kind of bring up the notion of translanguaging repertoire and polyphony, and hopefully we'll bring that back together somewhat. So the project then asked questions about how do people communicate in increasingly diverse city settings, and what are the implications for policy and practice in public, private and third sector organisations. So a very open question that the Arts and Humanities Research Council really allowed us to ask, and we are very grateful for their funding and their willingness to let us ask these open questions. The project did research in 4 UK cities, Birmingham, Cardiff, Leeds and London, and was divided around 4 thematic themes: business, heritage, sport and law. And within the cities it took one particular ward in which particular languages, according to the census, were spoken. And in Birmingham we chose to focus on varieties of Chinese, in Cardiff varieties of Arabic, in Leeds, sorry, it's a type of the Romani, Czech, Slovak and Portuguese, and in Newham, London, varieties of Polish. This is the way the project was designed, and so you'll see at the top there was a sociolinguist working across each city. So Adrian was the CI for the Birmingham project, and across each of the sociolinguists at the top: Francis Rock, Mike Bainham, James Simpson, Zhuhua and Li Wei. And then along the side we had a disciplinary expert kind of always coming in and making sure that they brought in other literatures into the discussion. So those academics are listed there. That's probably and we collected data in the way that linguistic ethnography typically does. That is, we observed, we were in the field for 2 or 3 days a week. There were usually 2 researchers, or sometimes 3, in each site, taking observational field notes, producing huge amounts of data, involved in audio recording. Our key participants, both at work and at home, doing some video recording, conducting interviews, conducting digital and online communication, particularly SMS messages, Facebook, that kind of thing, and taking photographs and other documents. So each of these cells is a full-length ethnography. I mean, a very rich story to be told across the 4 cities, and under each theme.
So one of the 16 connected ethnographies was of Bullring, the Bullring Market in Birmingham city centre, and in particular we focused on this butcher's stall, and so our key participant was Tiangang Chen, who was born in Yongle in Fujian province in China, and he'd arrived in the UK in 2001. And we were very much supported by Rachel, Rachel and I would stand side by side in a rather chilly market hall writing field notes. And here she's negotiating, attaching the audio recorder to butchers here, Bradley and Kang Chen, and you can see it's done in good spirit. They were excellent participants. We'll just give you a flavour of what the stall looks like. This tiny little bit of video is not very loud, I'm afraid. There are subtitles. It's not crucial that you hear everything.
Hello, boss.
Is the pork?
Pork, yeah.
Is this the...
No. You want the small intestine, don't you? No. You want that one, but the small one. Yeah, that goes wrong. Yeah, not that one. Not that one, no.
Tomorrow?
No, we can't get it no more. No more. Finished.
Finish.
Goya? No?
No good.
This one.
Give me this one here.
How much? All of it.
Give me one.
Nice one, yeah?
Yeah, nice.
Just one. Or one more?
No, just one.
You sure? Oh, you want one as well?
So you can find analysis of that interaction and hundreds of others in our various publications. There is also a short film made in the market. We work with a filmmaker who made a short film in the market and in many of our other research sites. That film is now on permanent display at Birmingham Museums and Art Gallery, if you're passing through that way, or you can find it on our website. And clearly in all of these research outputs, in one way or another, we're trying to represent the voices of the people, the participants, of Kang Chen, of all the other butchers, of the customers who were from all over the world and all over the country and so on. And so we're constantly faced with that challenge of how do we represent the voices which we collect in our empirical work as ethnographers. We've, as we suggested earlier, we've tried to take an approach which is polyphonic in trying to represent the voices in the market. And we've done that in this book, the actual book, rather than a picture of it. What we want to do for the remainder of our talk is to try to, I suppose, perform extracts from that book. The book is written in a way which is representing the voices of people in the market without showing the extensive analysis we've done of those voices, and also by constructing a dialogue between 9 people, 9 characters, which represents the discussions that we had as a 33-strong research team over 4 years. And at this point, we're going to ask for 9 volunteers to help us with that performance.
Just reading through, it's no element of performance, which is literally just...
All you have to do is read.
And it's short.
Thank you
so much, thank you. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Those corners over there. Sorry, can you push those to the corner? Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
So if you're volunteering, please put your hand up.
Yeah.
So I can see it clearly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Can we have
at the back of the bulletin?
4 more, yes, please.
Yes, thank you so much.
If you keep your hand up, because I'm going to give you a part. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so I'm afraid I'm going to point you. I don't know everybody's name. You're the pragmatic butcher.
That's just me, to a T.
The genial butcher. The researcher. The dramaturg. The entrepreneur. The photographer. the poet, and the professor.
Did you all catch your part?
So,
Yeah.
as I used to do when I was an infant school teacher, with pragmatic butcher, put your hand up. Genial butcher, put your hand up. Researcher, dramaturg, entrepreneur, photographer, poet, professor. Excellent. So I think we start with the entrepreneur.
I want to ask, what has it been like to be a research participant? How has it been for you, having microphones clipped to you and video cameras pointed at you, with these two writing down every word you speak and describing your every action? Was it, intrusive? Wasn't it uncomfortable?
It was all right. After a while, you forget that the researchers are there and get on with your work.
Yes, it was fine. It was a bit strange at first with the voice recorder and the microphone. But if I needed to switch the recorder off, I could.
But didn't you feel that you were being directed to behave in particular ways by the research team?
They told me to be myself. They said, don't do anything different from normal. That's what I did. I carried on selling meat.
So they did say that to you at least. Did they want you to behave in certain ways?
No. They said, just do what you normally do.
As researchers, we were there. We observed everything, and we recorded everything. But the life of the market would have gone on exactly the same if we had not been there.
I don't remember doing anything different. We just carried on as normal.
Having represented the voices of the butchers as text, having made films about them or whatever else, you don't feel this process makes them into new characters? That in some sense you are their authors?
It is still their voices. It's still them. We are taking authentic material, transcribing it, analyzing it, and presenting it. Are we creating new characters? No, I don't think so. Are we giving voice to those whose voices are normally unheard and unrepresented? I think yes. I think that is what we are doing.
It's both, I suppose. Recording what's there and making something new. There is a sense that whenever you represent a voice, you are creating a new character.
What? So when you record me selling a kilogram of chicken feet, you're making me into someone else? Really? I have to say, I think that's bollocks.
That's interesting. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Look, I'm a working man. For a living, I chop pigs into pieces, remove their guts, their entrails, the whole lot, and I sell the meat and offal for a few pennies so I can put bread on the table and provide for my kids. That's it. That's the long and short of it. I'm happy to be part of their research project because they're paying me. And anyway, it's something different from the usual stuff. It makes a change. But I'm a butcher, selling meat and offal. It's as simple as that.
What we are really grappling with is how art can imitate life in a way that allows life to be seen in a new light.
But you have to add in politics. It's about saying, where are the politics? What difference can art or theatre make to the inequalities and prejudices we see around us?
But does art really make any difference to the inequalities of the world?
We can't give up on that. We can't stop believing that there's a role for a theatre of social justice, for emancipatory film, for a poetry of liberation, for radical music. The arts can make a difference to the way people think.
You do see a film now and again that makes you think differently, that makes you want to change the way things are. What was the name of that film we saw? The one with what's his name? Not Beckham.
No, Cantona.
Cantona. The one with Cantona. That was a good film. Eric. Looking for Eric. That kind of thing.
That's what I mean. An art that makes you think differently. In art, we can see how people get along or don't get along. How they laugh, swear, cry, kiss. It's all there. The convivial and the everyday. Imitating life and going beyond life.
And another was that one we got out on DVD about how he applies for benefits and he dies before it gets sorted out. That was a terrible story. I cried watching that. There was no way out for him. That was a powerful film. People should see that.
I can tell you about the ups and downs of becoming a butcher. I can tell you about the friendships and the hardships. I can tell you about the prejudice. I can tell you about the thefts and the fights. I can tell you about the banter and the laughter, the trust and mistrust. I can tell you about the man waiting to buy ox hearts every Monday morning. I can tell you about the old woman who comes for the chat more than for the meat. I can tell you about the loyal assistant butcher learning a few words of Chinese. I can tell you about rhythm and rhyme. I can tell you about chicken feet and pig feet. I can tell you about blood, sweat and tears. I can tell you about the flower seller, the nails and beauty man, the shellfish woman, the supplier, the health and safety officer, the woman on the African stall, the shoe and boot trader, the man who does the t-shirts, the Vietnamese woman in the cafe. I can tell you about the halal butchers and the exotic fishmongers. I can tell you about the life of the market. But telling you would mean nothing. You have to be there.
And in part 2 of the book and the presentation, Angela and I will read from the field notes, the audio transcripts, the transcripts of interviews, and from the linguistic landscape of the market. A large mug of strong tea, salt and pepper pots, a plastic ketchup bottle in the shape of a tomato, chipped blue formica, signs on the wall, steaks and burgers, cooked dinner, beef, potatoes, gravy, takeaway, fish and chips. A young woman places a bacon sandwich on the table. The inside of her right arm is inscribed with Chinese characters. Outside the window, but inside the market hall, a poster. Poule plus vara, c'est délicieux. Hundreds of brightly coloured tins, packets and bottles line the high shelves of Remison Limited African Foods. The tattooed woman conducts a loud conversation about her social life with a man in the kitchen. He is frying bacon and wears a heavily stained blue striped apron. They both have broad local accents. Union Jack bunting hangs from the ceiling in constant celebration. Paint peels from the walls like dead skin.
I've been here for 14 years. The shop's been here 175 years. It's in the 5th generation now. It's always been family run. It started with a man called Byron, and it went down. I started as a Saturday girl, then a few years later, here I am. Our main trade now is Chinese. They'll come, guaranteed, every week. They probably spend the most money. Language barrier can be quite a struggle, but I think the more you get to serve them, the more you pick it up, really. The same as anything else. We get used to it, we get on with it, we have a laugh, we have a joke. We've got a lad here called Rob, and he usually serves a lot of them, the Chinese, and he's become quite fluent. He knows it all, so usually we just stick him there and let him get on with it. They like him, he likes them.
Here, darling, all that for £10, that old tray for £10, all that chicken half price today, all that chicken half price today. When it's gone, it's gone. Buy one, get a free one. £10 your chicken thighs, £10 drumsticks and thighs. A whole tray only a tenner, get the most of me a tenner, that old tray only £10. Come on, darling, how's that sound? That tray half price today, all that half price today, only today, darling. Come on, darling, you won't do better than that, you can't find cheaper than that. £10 a tray your chicken, £10 a tray your chicken, £10 a tray, £10 a tray, half price today, half price today.
I've learnt a few Chinese words like peiju, nianyan, laoji, laojie. When I first started on the stall, May told me to remember this word and that word and all the numbers, so I did. It comes quite easily now. Some of the words I can't pronounce, but when they say it, I know what it is. Some of the customers are shocked that I know what they're saying. They think I don't understand. I can do the hand gestures too, for the numbers from 1 to 10. People are always surprised. But you use whatever it takes, it isn't that hard. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Strawberry cordial, ackee, fufu flour, Dalgety honey and ginger, super malt, carnation evaporated milk, Fosca oats, Tate and Lyle granulated sugar, coconut peanuts, fish tea, cream wheat, smoked catfish fillet, small iwisa, Grace syrup, Glenrick pilchards, Nestle Milo instant malt chocolate drink, coconut oil, pumpkin soup mix, callaloo, Nido milk powder, butter beans, McDougall's self-raising flour, boneless saltfish, a bodie, honeycomb beef tripe, plantain chips, gizzard, cowfoot, Bible, English, Yoruba.
Watch straps,
Rat traps,
white booster,
feather duster,
fly paper,
ice scraper,
barbecue set,
mosquito net,
sewing machine oil,
aluminium foil,
wallpaper paste,
turkey baster,
sugar soap,
towing rope,
wasp killer,
wine chiller,
picture hooks,
plaster ducts,
fix and grout,
insect powder,
Elvis clock,
sink and blocker,
birthday candles,
door handles,
USB cable,
folding table,
measuring jug,
bath plug,
magnetic couch,
gate latch,
exterior filler,
ant killer,
reading lamp.
workbench clamp.
One of the butchers really bullied us when we first started. My husband eventually had a fight with him on the floor of the market hall. It was a really bad fight with meat cleavers. There was blood all over the place. It could have been really terrible if people hadn't intervened. It happened not long after we set up our stall.
You going to go for your dinner? I'm all right, I don't need to eat, I'm English. Just smoke.
A Chinese man buys pig kidney. He's served by the new assistant butcher with many tattoos, who wraps the kidney and hands the bag to the customer. $3.70. $3.70? $3.70. Too expensive, the customer laughs. £8 a kilo, explains the new assistant butcher with many tattoos. Oh, £8. $3.70. The man points to a tray of pork. The new assistant butcher with many tattoos bags it. $8.70, he says. $8.70? $8.70? $8.70? $3.70 and £5. $8.70. Oh, says the customer, and hands over a £10 note.
I sell flowers and I do plants. House plants, garden plants, vegetables. Anything what can be grown or eaten I sell. A lot of the people who come to the stall don't ever speak to anyone the rest of the week. A lot of them are elderly people. A lot of them are people who aren't working. They haven't got much to talk about. I chat to them and make them feel a little bit better, let them know I'm here. It doesn't matter if people speak to me in English, Chinese, Portuguese, it doesn't make no difference. The market is the heart and soul of the city. People can have a cup of tea, sit down, have a chat. I've learned a few words of Polish. That's just down to saying thank you, the basics. I can say donkey and I can say bread, but it's no good unless I want to give them a donkey sandwiches. You know what I mean? An elderly man nods to a plastic ice cream tub and holds up gnarled fingers and thumbs. 10 pig's hearts for £5. When the butcher weighs each heart in his hand and turns it to the light, it shimmers like a creature washed up, still wet from the sea.
Ni hao, ni hao! 5 white men in leather jackets shout greetings in mock Chinese accents as they walk by the stall. They roar with laughter. The pragmatic butcher glances at the loyal assistant butcher, but says nothing.
3 customers are looking at pork displayed on the counter. Cheap, cheap, says the pragmatic butcher. The men echo him. Cheap, cheap. The butcher says, very good. No fat, no bone inside there. How much all this? One of the men gestures to the remaining chickens on the counter. After some thought, the pragmatic butcher says, 35. The man holds out a £20 note. The pragmatic butcher repeats, 35. Still, the man presents the single note. The pragmatic butcher says, 3, 5, very slowly and deliberately. He holds up 3 fingers of his right hand and 5 of his left. The man again offers the £20 note. The pragmatic butcher draws a 3 and a 5 in the air. Still, the man offers the note. Now the pragmatic butcher draws a 3 and a 5 on the inside of the glass counter. The man continues to present the £20 note. The pragmatic butcher says no. 35. By this time, the negotiation has become a performance with smiles all round.
The genial butcher goes to the slaughterhouse every Monday morning for pig stomachs. She can take them for free as long as she removes them from the carcasses herself. They would otherwise be thrown into the furnace. She cleans them, stripping out the fat, running cold water through the intestine again and again to be sure all the feces are out, removing the fat that attaches to the inside of the stomach. The stench makes her sick. She doesn't do it for the little she can make on each stomach. Word is getting around. There's a Chinese butcher in the market selling products you can't get anywhere else.
If we have 2 minutes? No? We're out of time?
We're out of time. Do you want us to stop?
Okay, let's just go to the final slide then instead of... Is that all right? So just to conclude, well, the approach we're taking to ethnographic writing is an attempt to represent multiple voices, which includes the diversity of social speech types, as perhaps Bakhtin would have it, in a way that gives precedence to the marginal and peripheral voices and backgrounds the consciousness of the author, and foregrounds the consciousness of the research participants. And it views meaning as dynamic, unfinalized, and always changing. And we'd argue that the form of the text represents the discourse of everyday social life rather than simply the content of the text. And in so doing, we hope it counters monoglossic ideologies. That's us.
But quite similar to this was work I did over a number of years with a colleague in the theater department, teaching ethnography, using actor training techniques and using a lot of this polyphony and drawing the students into interacting. And it was really amazing how, I mean, what you could call, Andean culture kind of emerged from that. That was really a revelation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's definitely a direction we'd like to take this. Yes, please.
Have we got time for another question?
Yes, we can take another one.
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was really, really good. And first time I've seen anything presented like that, I think it was fantastic. I was just wondering, actually, if you had worked with any policy groups, and if you presented to them in this way, and what their reaction to it was, and how open or perceptive, or how useful they found that kind of presentation.
Yes, we've worked with policy groups, and no, we haven't presented the material in quite this way, and so yes, we should. I think.
What we have done is we had a creative arts lab in which we did have some policy people work with a number of artists who worked with us so that we represented our data differently. So we danced our data. We had an opera, a composer, we sang our data, and there were policy people involved in that, and that was really mind-blowing for all of us as academics. But I think the artists enjoyed the notion of translanguaging and thinking about communication and multilingualism in the city. So they were very interested in that. But they had us really thinking about our data in different ways. We had a graffiti artist as well. This was all because it was a funded project. We had the money to do that. We had the money to pay the artists. And the curator from Birmingham Museums came to that and became absolutely committed to using the arts in his own work as well. So not directly through us doing this kind of thing, but it was a very fruitful collaboration, I think, for us, for them and for us and for everybody.
Thank you. We can take one more. Is anyone itching to ask or comment? Yes, Georgia.
I really enjoyed that, thank you. I noticed when you were reading in that last section that there were some differences between the slides text and the text that you read, and I was wondering if you could speak about some of those decisions that you made, or how the...
We ought to say something very sophisticated about curation of material, but actually we were anxious about time and running over 30 minutes, and so we cut some sections.
Fair enough, just a technical reason then. Thank you.
But sorry, I did just a very quick response. I think also though what happens is, so this is the second time that we've done this. We did it once in our TLAN conference just a couple of weeks ago. And what I do notice is that every time somebody represents these voices, of course they bring another whole layer to the voices themselves. And as people read and as we read, you slightly, and that brings another whole discussion into the fore, actually.
There's more polyphony happening.
Yeah,
it's really interesting.
Exactly. So it's another whole discussion.
Well, just while they set up for the next speaker, I just make a comment on one of the things that came out to me strongly was the way in which the non-Chinese speakers are learning the Chinese, and that is such a lesson that we can learn. I think the Latin American context where there are such barriers around language. You know, if people don't know the other's language, there's this sense of the unknown, and I think a lot of it has to do with simply it's kind of, as I say, not knowing the other's language, and not having that openness to learning the other's language. I really think it's a key to countering racism, is to actually learn the other's language, but it requires a huge step to do that because there are so many preconceptions about what it would do to me to actually speak your language. Would I still be me? And I think there's a lot going on.
So we become quite interested in these kind of the notion of these kind of fragments or bits and pieces of language, because we found that that was both. It happened in many of our sites. People willing to use bits and pieces of language to kind of for conviviality and for moments of contact. And the market was full of people willing to learn other languages, despite what you might think on the face of it, kind of stereotypes of what I don't know, working class people might be, and then we were the market's a great place to do an ethnography of multilingualism.
And that's translanguage.
And that's translanguage, exactly. Yeah.
It was also interesting to see how language was also being used for a moment of conflict.
Yes, that's
where
true.
you had the Nihao being used in a very derogatory kind of way. Which is not what you.
There was a bit of that there as well.
Okay, I think
we'll have to move on now. It's a fantastic presentation, thank you. And thank you for making it performative and participatory. So we'll move on to our second keynote, Jan David Kalk from the London School of Economics. The paper is also with Guilherme Hurley, who cannot be here today for reasons of his workload, unfortunately. Jan has a fairly recent PhD in linguistic anthropology from UCLA, and he's now based in London at the LSE as a British Academy funded postdoctoral research fellow. And Jan's background is in anthropology and specifically in linguistic anthropology. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to look at the volume of Language and Cultural Communication, the special issue, I should say, of the journal Language and Cultural Communication, which he co-edited with Guilherme, which brings to light the big question about what is language and the natures of language, perhaps from a point of view that we're not so familiar with until now. Thank you, Jan.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rosalind, and the organizers for this exciting workshop. I'm very much looking forward for the remaining, for all of the discussions that we're going to, the lively discussions that we're going to be having today. Before I begin, as Rosalie mentioned, you were not expecting me to be alone up here. Unfortunately, my good friend and colleague Guilherme was not able to come here. He's very sorry to have to miss the event, but will be with us in spirits, as they say. And I do hope that his voice will resonate through mine. Guilherme has done a lot of work on the ways in which shamans' songs make present others' voices. And although I don't have any shamanic training, and I'm also not I'm afraid I'm not going to sing, I do hope his presence will be felt among us. On that note, I'm very glad the event is being video recorded, so that the multiple voices that will fill this room today may linger on and reverberate in the future and in distant places. We've come together today for a workshop on critical language research, specifically as the organizer has asked us to do, to reflect upon the possibilities upon why, despite all our efforts and the many critical tools that we've developed in applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, and linguistic anthropology, little use seems to have been made so far of our insights, be it in language planning and policy, in language revitalization movements, or bi- and multilingual education. Before all else, I should say that unfortunately I don't have a concrete answer to that question, let alone a quick remedy. But I do hope to contribute at least a few further points to consider that may have a bearing on the problem, and which I hope can help efforts at decolonization more broadly. Specifically, I'd like to suggest that even in many of our critical endeavors, we are still often trapped in a profoundly Western understanding of what language is and have not yet fully considered the possibility of other natures of language. So let me begin by contextualizing what I'll be exploring with the invitation of the United Nations and UNESCO to celebrate the International Year of Indigenous Languages. I'd like to point out that it's called the Year of Indigenous Languages, not the Year of Indigenous Ways of Speaking or Indigenous expression or Indigenous voices or languaging or something that could be other things that we might imagine. So I just want you to take this in for a second, and don't forget to notice the plural S on the languages here. The IYIL, as it's abbreviated, is designed to raise awareness of language endangerment and related issues, such as indigenous knowledge and culture, peace building, human rights, mutual understanding, reconciliation, sustainable development, and a number of others keywords that they have on their website. I'd like to specifically draw your attention to the very first one of these points, indigenous knowledge, described as unique systems of knowledge that unique systems of knowledge and understanding of the world. The claim that indigenous languages should be preserved in order to preserve indigenous knowledge systems is fairly commonplace in discussions of language endangerment. It's based on an old understanding, of course, of language as a kind of treasure house. The word is Johann Gottfried Herder's, a treasure house of people's knowledge and cultural traditions. What it implies is that somehow we need languages to understand and preserve indigenous knowledge. It seems to me that what we're missing is the inverse, the mobilization of indigenous knowledge to understand language. In the many discussions and conferences on endangered languages that I have attended, everybody seems to be fairly confident about what the objects they are talking about are, indigenous languages. And no one ever bothers to ask what these languages actually may be from the perspective of their speakers, and whether or not our scientific understandings may or not map onto the speakers' understandings. As a side note, of course, anthropologists in the room it will ring a bell with you. It is also problematic to talk about indigenous knowledge as if it was some sort of kind of disembodied thing that could be preserved. And while this discussion is related to what I'll be talking about, space constraints here do not allow me to address it directly. So if our goal is the decolonization of knowledge, then a crucial task is to tackle colonial understandings of language. And as I will suggest, they are more deeply rooted than we may think. So let's stay with the theme of the International Year of Indigenous Languages just for a little longer, and consider the recent issue of Anthropology News, bi-monthly publication of the AAA, which has also been dedicated to that year. My favorite part of the Anthropology News are the Going Native cartoons by Bernard Perley, which always comments in 3 frames on some topic of current interest. Perley is a Maliseet scholar, a linguistic anthropology professor at the University of Wisconsin, and future president-elect of the Society for Linguistic Anthropology. For the September-October issue of this year, he imagined how his ancestors on the Canadian East Coast might have reacted to the arrival of Viking explorers about 1,000 years ago. These are the 3 frames. He devised this comic strip in collaboration with his own mother, Henrietta Black, a respected Maliseet elder and fluent Maliseet speaker. The dialogue is in Maliseet. As you will have by now have found out, you will probably not be able to figure out what that means. The issue, the Anthropology News, does provide a text by Perley and his mother where he provides not only a translation, but also a discussion of the process of his own struggles as he tried to translate this dialogue from English into Maliseet. So the dialogue reads here, the first one is, "What is that? Is that human?" The other Maliseet person here says, "Let's check if it has language. It might be human." Then in the next frame, "Greetings, stranger. Are you human?" And then this is the representation of what they might have heard. And then the last one is, "Whoa, was that noise human?" Nope, not human. So there's a lot in these that we could discuss here. But I want to focus on the use of the word language, and especially the artist's own reflection and discussion of that translational problem. So I'm going to quote from his little paragraph from his text. He asks, how would one translate the English expression, let's check, and the word language? My mother decided on natsakitone, I apologize for the pronunciation, which translates as let's go see. But instead of language, my mother used lavestovic to indicate if it talks, it might be human. She decided to afford the stranger the possibility of speech rather than the possession of language. She is thinking in Maliseet, and I am stuck in English. To paraphrase Evans Pritchett, I've been using English idiom so long that I think in those idioms. Damn, I've gone anthropologist. It's the going native column. So my hunch is that some of our troubles with indigenous language revitalization and pedagogy may have to do with the fact that we've all gone anthropologist, or gone linguist for that matter. That is, that we are so accustomed to thinking in categories such as language that it is difficult for us to imagine an otherwise. And as a side note, in what regards the cartoon here, we might not only think of the question of language versus talking, but also, of course, the idea of language as what makes us human and related issues. So the notion of language has been the target of critical scholarship for many decades. At the risk of oversimplifying a vast body of literature, I'd like to suggest a fourfold schema. So there are mainly two strategies for critiquing language. One, getting rid of it. The other one, expanding it. And I think these, and we can discuss that later, I think these strategies operate mainly on two levels. For lack of a better term, I will call them here, and this is a little bit experimental too, so I'd love to hear your input. I'll call them simply language subscript 1 and language subscript 2. Let language subscript 2 refer to things such as English, French, Maliseet, Nicaraguan Sign Language, etc. What we usually refer to as language in our common discourse. The let language subscript 1 refer to language in general, so the human capacity of language without the possibility of that plural S that you can attach to different multiple languages. Before going any further, I should point out that this very distinction is not in any way a natural distinction, but the product of a very specific intellectual history laid out in detail by Bauman and Briggs's landmark study, Voices of Modernity. As Bauman and Briggs show through this history how social inequality has been deeply embedded in our common sense understanding of language. I don't have the time to go into detail here to their argument. I assume some of you will be familiar with it, but let me just lay out the main takeaways. So first, it was the making of language as autonomous domain. So we're talking about this level here. By 17th century philosophers such as John Locke, that they identify as responsible for the great divide between nature and culture, which then Latour has identified as underlying the modern constitution, and which has been debated a lot in recent decades. Second, that purification of language from all that messiness of the everyday talk devised to create a neutral device so that it could accurately represent scientific facts on the nature side and be a transparent, neutral medium for political debate on the society-culture side, is undermined by the fact that that purified, supposedly neutral language inevitably points back, indexically as it were, to the social status of its creators, 17th century intellectual elite. Third, since indexicality was camouflaged through that language ideological work of purification, it perpetuated hierarchies between languages and dialects, mixed languages, otherwise other forms of communication. And then fourth, once it had been established as a distinct and separate entity in subsequent centuries, language could be tied back, and we're now moving to that other level, to the social world by other philosophers such as, they cite of course Herder, but Humboldt is another name, etc. So who both link particular languages now in the plural explicitly with national and cultural traditions. Now, critical language research has attacked language on both of these levels. And I mentioned we can see these two strategies here, eliminate and expand. In what regards language one, we could argue, and this is sort of an incomplete list of some of these critical strategies. So in what regards language one here, we can argue that language doesn't exist. So people like, I think the first one was Herianto who took that stance, but we have also work of Tim Ingold, for example, Roy Harris, etc. And kind of substituted with performance, with discourse, with action, languaging, or communication, the semiotics. Peirce himself, of course, was fairly agnostic about what language is. After all, a sign doesn't have to be a linguistic sign. And exactly that attitude resonates in Eduardo Cohn's work and sort of his call for provincialization of language. But then sometimes we also simply expand language to include what before was not part of language. Language includes gestures, bodies in space, technologies, animals also have language, etc. So that when you get sort of, I'm thinking about the work on multimodality, embodiment, distributed cognition, the notion of cooperative action, spatial repertoires, and a lot of the stuff that has been done on the human-non-human interface. So, yeah, this is actually fairly common among linguistic anthropologists, but the recent excellent book, which I just finished reading by Pennycook, Posthumanist Applied Linguistics, takes also a lot of these ideas. And okay, then parallel criticism has been made with regards to that level of language too. So many have argued that languages, now in the plural here, don't exist at all, and we should shift our focus to linguistic units. Nick Enfield's kind of idea of the unit-based approach. Linguistic repertoires, translanguaging, etc. So, but we then also recognize language as sociopolitical constructs, and that we can't quite get rid of them. And then we like to point out the arbitrariness of linguistic boundaries. All languages are creoles, in the words of Marconi and Pennycook in their 2007 collection. We focus on the construction from interested political positions and emphasize heteroglossia, hybridity, creolization, and related notions. Now, let me make clear, I by no means do in any way want to criticize any of these efforts or suggest they wouldn't be important. They're crucial ways of destabilizing the Western and colonial constitution of language. But in regards to the question of this workshop, the question about a perceived kind of disjuncture between our critical work and local indigenous communities, I'd like to ask, could it be that our focus on criticizing Western common understandings has made us in some way inattentive to possibly radically different understandings? Could it be that indigenous communities' concerns are radically different because language is something radically different for them? Indeed, why are so many indigenous communities struggling to maintain and revitalize their languages as languages? Or why are so many others interested in adopting the languages of the former colonizers? Should we simply dismiss such efforts as Bourdieuvian misrecognition, colonization of the indigenous mind? Have they all gone anthropologists? Or could it be that our understanding of their understanding is wrong or at best incomplete? Maybe we just haven't understood what language is from an indigenous perspective. We haven't yet identified the equivocation between our understandings and thus are very far from controlling it. So we're simply talking past one another. And here's the crux of the issue. If it is true, as Bauman and Briggs suggest, that language, and specifically the distinction between these two linguistic levels, plays a major role in the creation of the modern divide between nature and culture, and if it's true that it's precisely that divide that is configured radically differently in indigenous ontologies, as has been debated extensively in the past 2 decades, then wouldn't language likely also be something radically different? So what we're trying to do is neither to eliminate language altogether or to expand it indefinitely to include everything else remotely related to it or resembling it. Rather, we call for an ethnographic openness to radical linguistic alterity. And I think the first step to such an openness is to eliminate that distinction between these 2 levels, language 1 and 2. As Guilherme and I wrote in the introduction to our special issue, maybe not all communicative phenomena can be understood as instances of a general phenomenon, language, at all, as different varieties, genres, registers, modalities, or different or other forms of discourse, but somehow we think they're still commensurable. Maybe they all are different things. We have come to call these differences in what language may be linguistic natures. By pluralizing language's very nature, we suggest that the concept of language may always be and should remain what Viveros de Castro has called an equivocation, indexing potential referential alterity. So, since this sounds all very abstract, I recognize that. Let me conclude by giving you 5 very concrete, 4 actually, concrete ethnographic examples where the alterity of indigenous linguistic natures may come to the fore. The first is the case from the Mapuche in Chile, reported on by Magnus Kors, who was actually also the first to kind of to formulate the idea of an ontological non-equivalence between languages, in his case Spanish and Mapudungun, the languages spoken by the Mapuche in southern Chile. Kors starts from the observation that the 2 languages that the Mapuche speak, Spanish and Mapudungun, stand in an asymmetrical relation to each other, where it is highly inappropriate to use Spanish in certain contexts, above all for particular rituals that have to be performed in Mapudungun. He links this inappropriateness to the Mapuche understanding that Mapudungun is actually coextensive with the force, Newen, that is constitutive of all being. Indeed, while Spanish is conceived of as the language or speech of the whites, Mapudungun is not conceived as the language of a particular group of people like the Mapuche, but rather as the language speech of the land itself. That is, so Dungun is the word for speech, and then Mapu is, of course, people. Mapu is the land. Mapuche means the people of the land. So Mapudungun is the language of the land, whereas Winca Dungun, which is the word for Spanish, Winca is a prefix which means new Inca, which kind of the Spanish came out. The first invasion that the Mapuche suffered were the Inca, so the Spanish were, the word for Spanish was modeled on the word for Inca. Winca, and then so Winca comes to represent Spanish, and then Winca Dungun is the language of the Spaniards, which is Spanish. Yeah.
But Dungun is the tongue. It's the because I understand that in English it's a language, but what is the meaning?
Well, of course. So the question of so Dungun here is well, I mean, I think it can also translate as speech, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So what Magnus does is link that to that Dungun is essentially coextensive with Mapudungun is essentially coextensive of the world. So the main point that he's pointing out that his work kind of points to is that it's wrong to think about either Spanish or Mapudungun as languages in the common sense of the term, that is, symbolic systems of representation, each indexical of different values and identities, but nonetheless somehow each arbitrarily linked to these identities and translatable. Instead, what he suggests is probably the case is that Spanish and Mapudungun are ontologically non-equivalent, that they're fundamentally different kinds of things, where Spanish is indeed an arbitrary system of signs that can represent things in the world, But Mapudungun is part of the world itself. So it's a force that exceeds human intentions and agency. So Mapudungun and Spanish, they don't come together on that level of language one. They're not instances of the same kind of phenomenon. So in our terms, they must be understood as having different linguistic natures. The second example comes from the famous Vaupés Valley in Colombia and Brazil. In the Vaupés, in the upper Rio Negro region in general, relations between patrilineal kin groups are governed by what has been termed in the literature linguistic exogamy, primarily defined as defined by the patrilact. So exogamy defined by the patrilact, that is the language of one's father's clan or sib. So essentially, you must marry someone who speaks a language different from the language of your father. A classic linguistic, anthropologically, or semiotic take on this phenomenon would interpret this in terms of indexicality, of course. The strong association between one's patrilact and one's kin group results from the fact that specific language practices, that is ways of speaking, ways of languaging, index a speaker's identity by virtue of their similarity to the practices of other speakers. We don't have any problems with, we immediately get to this kind of reasoning. However, Janet Chanella has a different interpretation from her ethnography among the Tucano, one of the groups in the area. She's placing the phenomenon in the context of Tucano personhood, because according to the Tucano, language is not merely a practice, but instead it's a corporeal substance, a material component of the person that is shared with one's paternal kin, hence the exogamy. So again, we're confronted with a radically different linguistic nature compared to our usual understandings. A third example comes from the Urarina of the Peruvian Amazon, as reported by Harry Walker. The Urarina use a particular class of chants called bao for healing children suffering from mystical harm caused by spirits and other non-humans. Someone experienced, not necessarily a shaman, but it could be the father as well, or an uncle of the child, whispers words into a bowl of mother's milk and other liquid, which is then ingested by the infant. Inside the body, the words spread out and paint or dye the blood, which alleviates the symptoms. Walker draws on work by Emanuel Fabiano, who explains that bao have the ability to penetrate and transform the body because they are themselves akin to a bodily fluid. And the words don't have just materiality, but also an agency of their own that allows them to have material effects on the body of the patient. Importantly, as Walker points out, comprehension of the words by the patient is not necessary, nor are they thought to carry any kind of message. On the contrary, the performative force of the ritual chanting is more like a physical action. Again, language is not just a symbolic system representing the world, a sign standing for an object, but rather an object itself, or rather a subject which is with its own materiality and its own agency. The last example, and maybe the one closest to heart to many here, comes from a working paper entitled Language is Breath by Juan Álvaro Echeverría about a Cátedra de Lenguas that he helped set up at the University in Leticia in Colombia. The motto of the cátedra was, aunque aprendas poco, se te abre el coco. So coco is, of course, the idea of the head. You become open to, to the world, I guess. But the point that they wanted to emphasize here is that the point that it's not the idea of the cátedra is not necessarily to learn, aprender, the language, but rather to feel it, like you can feel breath. And Juan Álvaro illustrates this with an anecdote from when he himself was in the process of learning the Murui language. And I really love his description, so I'm going to quote him directly. So he writes, I had, of course, enormous difficulties to understand speech, and I was very worried about that. Surely noticing my state of mind, once the old man, he's referring to his teacher, asked me in Murui, Kakadur, I think, which I believed to mean, do you understand? I candidly replied, no, I don't. He was very upset by my answer and sternly said to me, never answer like that. You must answer, yes, I do understand. And he provides the Murui here. In this way, he continued, you will not block the instruction. It will lodge in your body, and further on, it will speak itself. It made little sense to me that I could say I understand when in my consciousness I was not understanding much. Actually, the verb kakade, which I translate as to understand, means to hear, to smell, to feel. Certainly, it made little sense to him that I could state that I was refusing to feel the power of the word, its breath. So again, here we have language as an agent, not the object of the learning process, but a subject, an agent which we can only conceptualize in terms of a radically distinct linguistic nature. To conclude, let me add that I'm aware that we are not the first ones, of course, to explore phenomena such as the above. Indeed, there are many frameworks ready at hand that have been successfully used to describe them, in particular Peirce-inspired semiotics, conceptions of language as actions, and some others. However, that we still feel that none of these have attempted to give an answer to the question of what language actually is. Even semiotics, which has been especially popular for erasing, or rather circumventing, a rigid boundary between the sign and the world, it doesn't really help us understand what a particular local linguistic phenomenon actually may be in the context of indigenous ontology. Since everything can potentially be a sign, as long as it is interpreted as a sign, the question about its nature is simply irrelevant. However, by bypassing that question of the question of a given phenomenon's linguistic nature and confining our theoretical frameworks to concepts such as semiosis or action, removes our analysis even further from local understandings. So the gap between the native quote-unquote beliefs of what they are doing and quote-unquote our scientific access to reality is widened. This is why we do not think that simply eliminating language altogether or expanding it indefinitely is sufficient. As a third strategy in critical language research, we suggest to pay attention to the alterity, productively explore the implications of translational incommensurability of the term language. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, again, we'll take some minutes to, we have
Maybe there's questions or
a good 10
ideas.
minutes to discuss and comment, and indeed to link back to the first keynote if that's very nice. Next colour.
Thank you. It was very, very interesting because it questioned the notion of language itself, but without scientific knowledge about what is language, but also the ways to think with the communities about this definition. It's a definition, it's a concept, and my question that I can't be is when we talk about language, people has also the notion of language. It's not language as in English or in Spanish or in French, but they have a way to speak about their language. So, for example, in our communities, they spoke about tlacto, is the discourse. Is the way to talk. And in Mazatec, it's the way to speak, for example. And in Mapudungun, it was the tongue, it was the object. I understand that it's a kind of action, but the way to talk about this action, what is exactly? It's a kind of reminiscent of something in the body or in the action. For example, a way to speak.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm not an expert on Mapudungun,
Yeah.
but I think that's so. I think all of this is. I mean, what we're trying to do is, I think, to like really not immediately try to take these local understandings and plug it into, okay, this is the way they think about language.
Yeah.
Because then we've already defined language
Yeah.
on the kind of, on the meta level, kind of. Yeah, this is just, okay, this is, I mean, yeah. Yeah, Casey.
Just a quick
Or I don't know.
As you know, I'm very sympathetic to this argument about stepping back from our assumptions that we know that language is what's at stake. I think it's one of the challenges with this is that, well, there's a couple of them. One is that we're working usually, like in our context, with people who are very often bilingual and are actually operating between different language ideologies simultaneously. And those dominant ideologies in countries in Latin America often have very specific notions of language, just like the ones that you outlined. So I don't disagree with you, but I just think that it is quite a complex question to ask when you're asking it of a person who might have a radically different idea of what we call language is, but they're very often also, by no choice of their own, going through schools, being exposed to UNESCO discourses and state language policies that are doing exactly what you're saying we should be stepping back from. But I'm going to talk a bit about my paper as well.
Okay, great.
No,
No, yeah.
I think that's really got to the nub of really what we're trying to explore in the whole workshop, which is why, yeah, it's helpful. Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think I'm presenting, of course, a very kind of like, Magnus does a more nuanced argument than I was representing here. He does acknowledge that partly there is a commensurability, because there is, you can of course translate, but he says that doesn't exhaust what it actually is in local understandings. So that it's kind of a both and question, yeah, that there is a part where there might be kind of commensural linguistic nature, in that it can be used to communicate a message. But if we, I think some of the things that we're trying to do is, if we immediately think, okay, everything is about communicating a meaning, be that a denotational or indexic, like language as indexing identity, is essentially you communicate an indexical meaning, a social meaning, right? So if we immediately go there, then we can kind of have closed off any other possibilities of what language, why a particular, like the ritual that you can only use or should only use Mapudungun in particular ritual contexts, yeah. Or the kind of ideas of that language has an agency. I was like, we had a workshop on at the Salsa, and Anne-Christine Taylor was there, and she gave a really good comment from her work with the Achuar, where the Anand incantations that she's written extensively about as a way of communicating with plants. But then she said, well, there's actually the Achuar talk in two ways about the Anand. On the one hand, it's a medium of communication across species boundaries. But then she said, at the same time, the Anand is also thought as an entity itself, as a kind of, with an agency on its own. And she said she's been working on a paper on that, and I hope to learn more about that too. So there is oftentimes, I feel, that there are multiple, if you wish, multiple linguistic natures at the same, like operating simultaneously. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, sorry, I think it was Heidi first, and then Sheila.
Okay.
And Georgia, did you have? No. Heidi.
Great, thank you very much for an interesting paper. I have a few musing type things. So the strategies that you've put up as eliminating or expanding language, certainly many of those do come from ethnographic explorations of what you could call alterities or different ways of communicating. And so I'm kind of grappling with how is being open to alterity different than expanding, eliminating. I'm not sure that those things that you have under those category are quite so simple as simply eliminating, simply expanding.
I warned you, I'm oversimplifying here, yeah.
But one thing that I found useful is thinking of language, for lack of a better word, as a deictic, as something that points to many different things to many different people. So for some people it might point to a structure, for some it might point to land or some other form of meaning. So we have to find a way to talk about these things. So if we know that language means many things.
No, I think that's a fantastic, that's an absolute, I think like the idea of language as a deictic thing that can be different from what we assume it is. Like the Dungun part, which can point to the land or point to the people. I mean, there is, of course, both are called Dungun, Mapu Dungun, Winka Dungun, right? So I think this is the idea of like the idea of equivocation that we're trying to advert. So the idea of the multiplicity of linguistic natures essentially is an idea of the word language is an equivocation. And the problem is that we are talking past, oftentimes we just can't even fathom that in some contexts it might point to something quite different from what we are accustomed to. And the idea is kind of to productively explore, so to control the equivocation in various Castros' terms, yeah? to think about that sort of to open the idea that to be open to the idea that language might be different from what we think it is.
Expanding it more radically than
exactly. I mean, so not just exactly. So I'm essentially thinking like, okay, if we like for example, I don't want to be too critical here, but like Eduardo Con's work on, which I love very much, with the Runa, he's essentially saying, well, we need to expand language. He's part of the expand language to include all other kinds of beings that also, and says like, well, let's get rid of language, let's talk about representation. But what he's then doing is that essentially he's, by saying that, well, there is something special about human representation, which is symbolic, but non-humans, of course they represent us, but they do so in a radically different way. In some ways, through the back door, he smuggles back in to this kind of idea of human exceptionalism and the idea of that there is some radical difference, yeah, which is it essentially is he's still upholding kind of singular ontology, if not of language, then at least of communication, yeah, and I think if we too easily just plug in our data into some like framework like semiotics or like the whole question of performativity and language as action is incredibly useful for describing stuff that we see, like that language can have an impact. But we need to examine then our understandings of where is the agency located. Is it always in the speaker, as our Western understanding would be, like the intentionality of the speakers? And of course, we use language to do things with it, do things with words. But that might not actually be where the action comes from within a different ontology.
We have Sheila.
Sorry, I'll let you take the question.
I think it's probably much comment. I think it's really absolutely fascinating, and the idea of kind of how to explore the equivocation from the work I've done over decades in proving Amazon as a numerically small indigenous group. I mean, I'm very much with you on the discussions around alterity, from having been there and sort of documented work of hunters and gatherers with the spirit world.
Great, yeah.
In order the spirit to hunt, to dream. And then another aspect to my work has very much been with education, formal education, bilingual education. And the two worlds seem so far apart. Yet at the same time, you've got a whole dynamic around the forest disappearing because of gold mining around in working, a whole sort of radical change of the environment. So the spirit world itself has been changing. And how does that all relate then to this kind of bilingual education program in the school where you've got the Spanish and you've got the Malagasy?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. A very interesting paper. I just feel that your project is still objectifying language in the Western trap, and you're not integrating methods that allow you to expand it out into a more participative or translinguistic.
I mean, like, of course, I think, well, I see the paper, yeah, I think it's very kind of intellectual, if you wish. Yeah, it's a very much kind of undoing, and I think, but I kind of hesitate. I don't want to now like come up with, okay, this is the program, this is how we should be doing it. Yeah, I feel hesitant to be the one, like, I don't feel I have the competence to really say, like, what is the kind of, like, the how-to of how do we explore other linguistic natures. But I think what I'm trying to do is make us aware of some of our sort of very deep-grained assumptions and sort of I want to get rid of the easy way out of looking at the phenomena that we're encountering. Yeah.
I just want to follow on for that, because I think there is a question about us as academics, because, you know, in making the arguments that we make, we kind of perpetuate our disciplinary fields and our place in the academy and our work, and we kind of need these arguments to have a job and all the rest of it. But it is an important point, because, you know, we're all part of perpetuating the arguments that have kind of historically been there, and it's both, well, it's a worry, really. I mean, I think it's a very good point, actually. It's about how in our critiques we actually reproduce the boundaries and possibly the inequalities, actually. So I think it's a good point for us all to think about as we have these interdisciplinary conversations and we make the arguments that we make.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond at all to those three?
Oh, well, I think I took that more as a comment. But, I mean, what you're saying, I think, yes, I fully agree. It's an important question. I do think, though, that there is being in the academy gives us, if we want it or not, a privileged position to setting agendas. Because we don't, simply because we have doctors and or teach about things, people inevitably kind of assume that we know what we're talking about. So I don't think we shouldn't like use these our positions in order to maybe kind of question, like, which someone from an indigenous community might just not have the audience or the means to question some of these deep-grained assumptions that we're carrying, the sort of the baggage that we're carrying with us, especially when it comes to language policy and language planning. Because especially, I think there's things where, language planning activities, like the people who are often sitting at the table have a very, very narrow understanding of, but then still they're crafting the policies. So yeah, I think trying to counter that is an important task. That is one of the tasks that we can do as academics, and maybe just for the sake of fostering more dialogue, and not just saying like, hey, maybe you just haven't looked at it, and not just prescribing some alternative.
But
I mean, okay, can I make one last? Can I make one last point, which is the idea of. I'm very sympathetic to the idea of like all this, like the critiquing of language, putting it like language substituting with languaging, etc. But I think language is just there as a discursive object, ubiquitous, and this kind of, it's used as, I mean, a lot of local understandings are being mapped onto language, this kind of, that thing language that has now kind of the Western understanding that has come to dominate all the discourses on linguistic diversity, language endangerment, etc., right? So if we kind of get rid of it completely, yeah, then we're losing sort of the potential to actually transform it. I think what we're trying to do is trying to open the open up new possibilities of thinking about transforming it generally, yeah, so that discussions of language endangerment may include, they can continue to use the word language, is fine, but maybe start thinking about other things that it could be, sort of thinking about it differently. I think that's sort of the main goal that we're having with our intervention.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Jan, very much.
Thank you.